perched high upon a solitary hill, overlooking the township of Junee in New South Wales, sits a residence that breathes an atmosphere of profound sorrow and malevolence. The Monte Cristo Homestead stands as a testament to the Victorian era ambition of the late 19th century. Yet, it hides a history stained with blood and tragedy. Visitors who dare to ascend the winding driveway often report an immediate sensation of being watched by unseen eyes from the towering balcony. The air surrounding the property feels unnaturally still and cold regardless of the sweltering Australian summer heat. It is a place where the boundary between the living and the dead feels terrifyingly thin. Shadows seem to move of their own accord within the high windows, and a deep sense of dread settles into the marrow of anyone foolish enough to linger after dark. This is not merely a house, but a monument to misery. The story of this infamous abode begins with a man named Christopher William Crawley, who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the wealthiest men in the region. Christopher William Crawley arrived in the area in the 1870s and saw potential where others saw only dust and struggle. He established a hotel and capitalized on the construction of the Great Southern Railway line, which brought an influx of workers and money into the town. His fortune grew rapidly, and with his newfound wealth, he purchased a large plot of land on a hill that commanded a view over the entire district. It was here that he decided to build a family home that would reflect his status and power. He envisioned a grand manor that would stand for generations, but he could not have foreseen the darkness that would plague his lineage. And the very stones of the house he constructed. Construction on the Monte Cristo Homestead began in the year 1885, and it was a massive undertaking that required the finest materials available. Bricks were fired in local kilns, and intricate iron lace was imported all the way from England to adorn the sweeping verandas. The interior was furnished with heavy velvet drapes and cedar staircases and crystal chandeliers that cast a flickering light through the hallways. It was a symbol of ultimate success, and Christopher William Crawley ruled over his domain like a king. However, the foundation of this grandeur was built upon a strict and unforgiving social hierarchy. The servants who dwelled within these walls were often treated with disdain, and the family lived a life of rigid Victorian morality that concealed deep secrets. The walls were thick, and they absorbed every whisper of pain and every cry of despair that echoed through the rooms. Elizabeth Crawley was the matriarch of the household, and her presence was as formidable as the architecture itself. She was a woman of steel will who demanded absolute perfection and obedience from her children and her staff. Locals whispered that her heart was as cold as the marble fireplaces that heated the drawing rooms. She rarely left the house and spent most of her time overseeing the domestic operations with an eagle eye. Under her supervision, the homestead ran like a clockwork machine. But the pressure on those living there was immense. It is said that her spirit imprinted itself so heavily onto the residents that she never truly left even after death. Her spectral form is frequently reported by visitors who describe an imposing woman in period dress, ordering them out of her dining room with a glare that chills the blood. One of the most tragic tales associated with the homestead involves a young maid who worked for the Crawley family during the late 19th century. Rumors swirled that this young woman had become pregnant, and the father was heavily implied to be Christopher William Crawley himself. In a time of strict moral codes, such a scandal would have ruined the reputation of the family and destroyed the social standing of the master of the house. The maid was confined to the upper levels of the house to hide her condition from the prying eyes of the town below. Her isolation was absolute, and her despair must have been overwhelming. As she paced the floorboards of the servants' quarters, the atmosphere in those upper rooms remains heavy with a crushing sadness that brings tears to the eyes of sensitive individuals who walk there today. The culmination of this secret tragedy occurred on a moonless night when the young maid plummeted from the second-story balcony to the hard-paved courtyard below. Whether she jumped in a fit of hopelessness or was pushed by a hand seeking to erase a shameful secret remains one of the great mysteries of Monte Cristo. Her body struck the stone with a sickening thud that ended her life and the life of her unborn child instantly. It is said that the bloodstain on the steps could never be washed away, no matter how hard the other servants scrubbed. To this day, guests report seeing a white figure falling from the balcony in their peripheral vision, only to vanish before hitting the ground. The echo of a woman screaming often pierces the silence of the night, terrifying those who stay in the homestead. Another horror that stains the history of the estate involves the stables where the horses were kept. A young stable boy named Morris was employed to care for the animals, and he was known to be a hard worker who slept in the straw to stay warm. One fateful day, he fell ill and was too weak to rise from his makeshift bed in the hay. His master, or perhaps another servant unaware of his presence, set fire to the pile of straw to clear out the waste. The dry material ignited instantly, and the flames consumed the boy before he could escape. His screams of agony were said to be deafening as the fire tore through the stable block. The poor boy burned to death in a terrifying inferno that left nothing but ash and bone. The spirit of the stable boy is believed to haunt the coach house to this very day. Visitors often report the smell of burning straw and rotting flesh that manifests suddenly and disappears just as quickly. The sensation of intense heat sometimes washes over people standing near the old stable doors, even in the dead of winter. Some have reported feeling small hands grabbing at their legs, as if begging for help, or pulling them towards the darkness. The anguish of his final moments seems to be trapped in a perpetual loop, replaying the horror of the fire over and over again. It serves as a grim reminder of the negligence and cruelty that often lay hidden beneath the veneer of upper-class Victorian respectability. Tragedy did not only befall the servants of Monte Cristo, but also struck at the heart of the Crawley family itself. A young infant granddaughter of Christopher William Crawley met a violent end on the grand cedar staircase. The story goes that her nanny was carrying the baby down the stairs when she claimed to have been pushed by an unseen force. The nanny lost her grip, and the child tumbled down the steep wooden steps, striking her head with lethal force. The baby died from her injuries, causing immense grief and suspicion within the household. The nanny was dismissed and blamed for clumsiness, but she maintained until her dying day that something evil had shoved her. Some believe a jealous spirit or a dark energy resident in the house was responsible for the death of the innocent child. The energy around the staircase is reported to be particularly malevolent and disturbing to children who visit the house. Many parents have watched in horror as their children stop and stare at an empty space on the stairs, appearing to communicate with an invisible entity. Others have reported feeling a firm shove on their backs as they descend, similar to what the nanny described over a century ago. Cold spots are frequent in this area, and the sound of a baby crying can sometimes be heard echoing from the upper landing when no child is present. It is a heartbreaking remnant of a life cut short and a family torn apart by sudden loss. The staircase remains a focal point for paranormal activity, suggesting the trauma is still fresh. Perhaps the most disturbing story of all concerns the son of Christopher and Elizabeth, named Harold Crawley. Harold suffered from a mental disability, and in that era such conditions were misunderstood and often treated with shame. Rather than receiving medical care or compassion, Harold was kept hidden away from society to protect the family name. He was confined for decades in a small cottage at the rear of the property and was rarely allowed to see the light of day. The isolation he endured was absolute and cruel. To ensure he did not wander off or cause a scene, he was often chained up like an animal. The metal chains rubbed his skin raw, and the sound of rattling iron became the soundtrack of his miserable existence. Harold lived a life of utter despair until his death, and his spirit is said to be one of the most angry and active on the property. The cottage where he was imprisoned is a place of intense negativity, where visitors often feel a wave of nausea and aggression. The sound of heavy chains dragging across the stone floor is a common auditory hallucination reported by those who dare to enter his prison. Some have even heard a low, guttural growling that seems to come from the corner of the room where he was tethered. It is believed that the rage Harold felt in life has only amplified in death, and he lashes out at the living who intrude upon his space. His tragic life is a dark stain on the legacy of the Crawley family. The reign of the Crawley family eventually came to an end with the death of Elizabeth Crawley in 1933. She died in the house at the age of 92, having outlived her husband by many years. Her passing marked the end of an era, but the house did not fall silent. It sat empty and abandoned for years, and became a target for vandals and local youths seeking a thrill. The once grand gardens became overgrown with weeds, and the windows were smashed by stones. The house began to rot from the inside out, mirroring the decay of the secrets it held. However, even in its abandoned state, the locals of Junee avoided the hill at night. They knew that something resided in the empty halls that was not welcoming to the living. In the year 1961, a caretaker was murdered in the caretaker cottage in a crime that shocked the local community. A local youth obsessed with the film Psycho, which had been released the previous year, came to the property with a rifle. He shot the caretaker in cold blood and carved words into the door inspired by the movie. This brutal act of violence added another layer of blood to the soil of Monte Cristo. It seemed that the house acted as a magnet for death and insanity, drawing in darkness from the surrounding world. The murder reinforced the reputation of the homestead as a cursed place where evil festered. The spirit of the caretaker is now added to the legion of ghosts that are said to walk the grounds. The salvation of the physical structure came in 1963 when a couple named Reginald and Olive Ryan purchased the dilapidated estate. They bought the house for a meager, some intending to restore it to its former glory and raise their family there. They were unaware of the full extent of the haunting until they moved in and began the arduous task of renovation. From their very first night in the house, they realized they were not alone. They had no electricity connected, yet the house would be illuminated by mysterious lights that vanished when investigated. Their belongings would be moved or disappear entirely, only to reappear in impossible places. The Ryans were practical people, but they could not deny the impossible events unfolding around them. Olive Ryan often spoke of a presence that would watch her as she worked to clean the grime of decades from the walls. She felt a deep connection to the house, but also a profound fear of the entity that claimed dominion over it. One evening, as they were returning home, they saw every light in the house blazing brightly despite the power still being disconnected. When they reached the front door, the lights extinguished, instantly leaving the house in pitch black darkness. It was a clear message from the spirits that the Ryans were merely guests in a house that belonged to the dead. The activity was not just visual, but physical, as members of the family were touched and pushed by invisible hands. The most terrifying encounters for the Ryan family involved the spirit of Mrs. Crawley herself. She seemed to resent the new owners changing her home and made her displeasure known. Olive Ryan reported feeling an icy hand on her shoulder on multiple occasions. While she was in the dining room, the temperature would drop dozens of degrees in seconds, and a commanding voice would sometimes order her to leave. It became clear that Elizabeth Crawley still considered herself the mistress of Monte Cristo and viewed the Ryans as intruders. This psychological warfare wore down the family, but they refused to be driven out. They learned to coexist with the entities, acknowledging their presence while trying to live a normal life. The activity at Monte Cristo is not limited to the house itself, but extends to the entire grounds. The balcony where the maid fell is a particularly active spot where photographers often capture unexplained mists and orbs. People standing on the lawn below have reported seeing a woman in a period gown staring down at them with hollow eyes. The feeling of grief is palpable in this area, and some visitors are overcome with sudden, inexplicable weeping. It is as if the emotional residue of the suicide has stained the very atmosphere, creating a pocket of sorrow that time cannot heal. The tragic maid seems doomed to replay her final desperate moments for eternity. Another room that inspires dread is the boys' bedroom, where the spirit of a child is often sensed. Toys are said to move on their own, and the laughter of a young boy can be heard echoing in the hallway. However, this is not a playful spirit, but one that feels lost and confused. Some psychics who have visited the homestead believe this is the spirit of a child who died of illness in the house, or perhaps another unrecorded tragedy. The energy in the room is erratic, shifting from innocent to menacing in a heartbeat. Visitors are often warned not to touch the toys or disturb the arrangement of the room, lest they invite the attention of the entity. The drawing room is the domain of the sophisticated but stern spirits of the adult Crawleys. It is here that the smell of cigar smoke is often detected, even though no one has smoked in the house for decades. This is believed to be the spirit of Christopher William Crawley, overseeing his estate. He appears to be a more passive observer compared to his wife, but his presence is heavy and authoritative. Guests have reported seeing a man in a suit standing by the fireplace, watching the tour groups with a critical eye. He seems to be guarding his legacy, ensuring that the history of his rise to power is not forgotten by the modern world. One specific incident that terrified a group of visitors involved the vintage carriage stored in the coach house. As the group listened to the guide tell the story of the stable, the heavy carriage began to rock violently back and forth. There was no wind, and no one was touching the vehicle. The movement was accompanied by the sound of horses' hooves clopping on cobblestone despite the floor being dirt. The group fled in terror, convinced that the ghost of the stable boy, or perhaps the horses themselves, were manifesting. This physical interaction with the material world is rare but undeniable evidence for those who have witnessed it. It suggests the spirits have the power to manipulate heavy objects at will. Animals seem particularly sensitive to the haunting of Monte Cristo and often refuse to enter certain rooms. The Ryan family had a cat that would hiss and arch its back at empty corners, staring at things the humans could not see. One morning, the cat was found dead, with its neck broken in a room that was locked from the outside. The Ryans believed that a malevolent force had killed the animal, perhaps the angry spirit of Harold, or the stern ghost of Mrs. Crawley. This incident served as a dark warning that the entities in the house were capable of violence against living creatures. It added a layer of physical danger to the psychological horror they were living through. Over the years, many paranormal investigators and television crews have visited Monte Cristo to document the hauntings. Almost all have left with unexplained recordings and personal experiences that shook their skepticism. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, are commonly captured recording voices that whisper names and threats. Cameras often malfunction, or batteries drain instantly upon entering the most active rooms. One crew member was scratched by an unseen hand, leaving 3 red welts down his back that burned for hours. These documented cases have cemented the reputation of Monte Cristo as the most haunted house in Australia. It is a place where the supernatural is not a possibility, but a certainty. The doll room is another area that visitors find exceptionally creeping and unsettling. It is filled with antique dolls with porcelain faces and glass eyes that seem to follow you as you move. While dolls are naturally creepy to many, the ones at Monte Cristo seem to possess a life of their own. Guests have reported the facial expressions of the dolls changing when they look away and look back. Some claim to have heard the dolls whispering to each other in high-pitched giggles. Whether inhabited by spirits or simply absorbing the ambient energy of the house, the doll room is a place where few people can stand to remain for more than a few minutes. There is a specific area in the hallway where a ghost known as the floating woman is seen. She is described as wearing a long white dress, and she hovers a few inches above the floorboards. Unlike the other more solid apparitions, she appears translucent and misty. She does not seem to acknowledge the living, but drifts aimlessly from room to room, as if searching for something she lost. Some speculate she is another servant girl, or perhaps a guest who died in the house during the early 20th century. Her silent, sorrowful procession is one of the more melancholic sights in the homestead, contrasting with the angry energy of Harold or the stern presence of Elizabeth. The current owners of the house have embraced its haunted reputation and offer ghost tour to the brave public. These tours allow people to experience the atmosphere of the house at night when the activity is at its peak. Many participants have had to leave the tour early due to overwhelming feelings of nausea or panic. Fainting is a common occurrence, particularly in the dining room and on the staircase. The physiological reaction of the human body to the presence of these entities is profound. It is as if the biological survival instinct kicks in, warning the person to flee from a predator they cannot see. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a skeptic who visited the house determined to debunk the stories. He spent the night in one of the bedrooms and mocked the ghosts aloud, asking them to show themselves. In the middle of the night, he was woken by the sensation of hands choking him. He could not breathe and struggled against an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. When he finally managed to turn on the lamp, the pressure vanished, but deep red finger marks were visible on his throat. He left the house immediately at 3 in the morning, terrified and humbled. The house does not take kindly to mockery. The sheer number of deaths and tragedies associated with a single residence is statistically staggering. From the stable boy to the maid to the infant and the caretaker, the list of fatalities is long and grim. It leads one to wonder if the land itself is cursed, or if the house acts as a battery, storing the negative energy of each event. Some theories suggest the hill was a sacred or forbidden site for the indigenous people long before the Crawleys arrived. If true, the construction of the homestead may have disturbed ancient forces that have been exacting revenge ever since. The convergence of ley lines is another theory often discussed by paranormal enthusiasts. Despite the horror, the house is a beautiful example of Victorian architecture preserved in a time capsule. The furniture and decor remain largely unchanged, allowing visitors to step back into the 1800s. But this preservation also seems to lock the spirits in place. They are surrounded by the familiar objects of their lives, and perhaps do not realize they are dead or simply refuse to move on. The house is their world, and they guard it jealously against the intrusion of the modern age. The creaking of the floorboards is not just settling wood, but the footsteps of the past pacing endlessly. Lawrence Ryan, the son of Olive, and Reginald now looks after the property and has his own lifetime of stories. He grew up with the ghosts and accepts them as part of his family. He tells of seeing the face of a man peering out of the attic window when he was a child, even though the attic was locked. He speaks of the times his bed would shake violently in the middle of the night. To him, the supernatural is a mundane reality, a fact of life that must be navigated. His acceptance, however, does not diminish the danger or the fear that the house can instill in strangers. The legacy of Monte Cristo is one of dark duality, mixing immense wealth with terrible suffering. Christopher William Crawley built a monument to his success, but it became a prison for his family and his servants. The gold and the velvet could not protect them from the madness and death that seeped into their lives. It serves as a Gothic cautionary tale that money cannot buy happiness or safety. The house stands as a grim reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that some stains are too deep to ever be washed away. As you leave the Monte Cristo Homestead and drive back down the winding hill, the feeling of dread slowly lifts. But for many, the experience leaves a mark that lasts long after they have returned to the safety of their own homes. They find themselves checking the shadows in their own rooms, wondering if something followed them back. The image of the woman on the balcony, or the sound of the chains dragging on stone, haunts their dreams. The house has a way of getting inside your head and staying there. It is a psychological infection that spreads through fear. Ultimately, the Monte Cristo Homestead remains Australia's most infamous ghostly abode, because the stories are backed by a palpable atmosphere of evil. It is not just a tourist attraction, but a place where the veil is torn. The spirits there are not resting in peace. They are active and aware and waiting. They watch every car that drives up the hill and every person who steps through the door. And as the sun sets over Junee, the house comes alive in the darkness, reclaiming its title as the kingdom of the dead. The dread lingers, not because of what you saw, but because of the certainty that next time you might not be allowed to leave.